Hello, and welcome to the History of the Railways, a podcast with the ridiculous goal of telling the story of the railways across the world. Season 1, Episode 5, The Rainhill Trials Part 2, Trials and Tribulations. In the last episode, I introduced the engines that would compete at the Rainhill Trials, and the men behind those engines. Thomas Brandreth's Cycloped, Timothy Burstall's Perseverance, Braithwaite and Ericsson's Novelty, Hackworth's Pareil, and the Stephenson's and Booth's Rocket. And we saw that as far as the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway were concerned, the Rainhill Trials wasn't a competition between locomotives, as we usually think of it. Instead, it was a test to prove that any locomotives were a viable option. Today, in the second of our two-parter on the Rainhill Trials, we'll see how those trials worked out. And I suppose I should say, I won't even ask you to pretend that you don't know the result. Think of this episode as more of a what happened along the way story than a how on earth does it end story. But before we get to it, we need to answer our last trivia question. On the last episode, I asked, whose 060 Dreadnought was intended for the Rainhill Trials but wasn't complete in time? And the answer was Edward Berry. Dreadnought was supposed to compete at Rainhill, but wasn't ready, and then when Berry later tried to sell it to the LNMR, it was apparently thought to be too heavy for the line. OK, on with the show. So, on the 31st of August, with the competitors around the country scrambling madly to get their entries finished, the Liverpool and Manchester board agreed that the place of trial for the specimen engines on the 1st of October next be the level space between the two inclined planes at Rainhill. At the same time, they instructed their engineer, some chap called George Stephenson who keeps cropping up, to prepare that stretch of railway for the competition. The date would slip to the 6th of October, but the place was set. It's been said since the time of the trial that Braithwaite and Ericsson only heard of the competition at the beginning of August, which would certainly make for an exciting story, and I was tempted to give you an easy tale of them racing against time to get their engine completed. But if it's true, then they've only got themselves to blame. I've seen the advert myself in a copy of the Times from the 4th of May. In fact, it was a word-for-word copy of the one from a Liverpool paper I read out at the start of the last episode. So maybe they missed it, but rich, successful London engineer fails to read establishment newspaper doesn't make for such a plucky underdog story, does it? Given that the ultimate source can only have been Braithwaite and Ericsson themselves, I suspect there's an element of conscious myth-making involved in it. In fact, only Timothy Hackworth seems to have failed to grasp the need for winning the public relations battle. Though whether he failed to grasp it or simply felt it was beneath him to play that particular game, who can tell at this distance? Someone who definitely wasn't above a little underhand behaviour, though, was Timothy Burstall. We know nothing about his preparation of Perseverance, but we do know that on the 31st of August, Robert Stephenson discovered him poking around his workshop at 4th Street, examining the engine that would become known as Rocket. I was extremely mystified to find that he walked into the manufactory this morning and examined the engine with all the coolness imaginable before we discovered who he was. Robert wasn't worried, though. He has, however, scarcely time to take advantage of any hints he might catch during his transient visit. And as it turns out, he was right. But it wasn't like Robert was free from worrying about his competitors altogether. It was just that those worries focused on someone else, Timothy Hackworth. And the close watch he kept on Hackworth shows that he wasn't exactly lily white himself. Many of his letters to Henry Booth discuss the progress of Hackworth's entry, and they betray a familiarity with it that might have led Hackworth to be equally mystified if he knew. By the time of Burstall's clumsy attempt at espionage, though, Robert's engine was almost finished. Just a couple of days later, he took it on its first test run on the line at Killingworth, and on the 12th of September, it was taken apart and began its journey to Rainhill. In fact, it's interesting to reflect briefly on that journey. Rocket left Stephenson by road, pulled by horse and cart, then was taken on a barge along the Carlisle Canal, before being carried by ship from Bowness-on-Solway to the Liverpool docks. By the time it got to the LNMR's Millfield Yard outside Crown Street Station on the 18th, it had used every means of transport the 19th century had to offer, bar one, rail. And just over a fortnight later, it would add that to the list under its own power. When Rocket was taken from its crate in the yard, they discovered that the smaller rear wheels had broken in transit. With time to spare before the trials, the Stephensons and Booth can't have been too concerned at first. But that concern probably grew as the trial got nearer and nearer with no replacement wheels in sight. When they finally did turn up, the day before the trial, they didn't even fit on the axle journals. No doubt genuinely worried now, and sweating slightly, someone had the idea of fitting a set of wagon wheels in their place. This worked a treat, and so when Rocket ran later that day and throughout its trial, Its trailing wheels came from a coal wagon. Hackworth, meanwhile, was still struggling to get his engine complete. He didn't have the necessary equipment at Shildon to produce all of the components, so he'd outsourced most of the work to a variety of companies that did, including Robert Stephenson and Company. This was a fact that would later lead to accusations of shoddy workmanship and even intentional sabotage, but we're not there yet. What it meant in the short term was that by the time all the parts had been delivered and assembled, Hackworth had no time to test his engine rigorously before he had to transport it to Rainhill. According to his son's later account, a run of a few miles at midnight on the Aycliffe level was all the trial it got. But if that was all the trial that Hackworth got, he was still better off than Braithwaite, who by living in London was peculiarly disadvantaged. His Euston Road workshop was 200 miles south of the most southerly railway of the time, the one he was going to be testing on. When Novelty arrived at Rainhill, the men loading it onto the line discovered that the wheels were set at the wrong gauge. Before it stood any chance of competing, they'd need to find someone skilled enough to make the adjustments necessary to the wheel flanges. Step forward, Timothy Hackworth. Yes, apparently Hackworth worked through the night to help ensure his competition could run. Given what a grumpy bugger he was through the rest of the trials, this seems to be an amazing demonstration of the spirit of competition. Sadly for Braithwaite and Ericsson, the gauge of the wheels was hardly the end of Novelty's issues, as we'll see shortly. The next morning, Tuesday the 6th of October 1829, the trials started. Kind of. But first, let's describe the scene. Despite being 4 years on from the Stockton and Darlington Railway, locomotives would have been just as new to most of the Rainhill spectators as they were for the crowd I described in episode 3. All of the excitement that we saw at the opening of the S&DR was replicated here, and more if possible. Between them, Liverpool and Manchester at this time had a population of about 300,000. Stockton and Darlington's combined was less than 20,000. So, expecting a crowd of the great and the good, the directors of the LNMR had erected a grand marquee to shade the ladies from the sun. And, expecting a possibly even larger crowd of the less great and good, they'd also made 300 of their workers special constables to make sure everyone behaved. This was precisely 1 week after Sir Robert Peel, who'd attend the L&M that day, had formed the Met, which as it happens wasn't Britain's first police force, that was in Glasgow, but it does go to show that the L&M directors organising their own police force wasn't unusual, it was necessary. If you wanted police, you had to organise them yourself. Anyway, the directors' expectations of large crowds weren't disappointed. The side of the railway was lined with carriages and men on horseback, and pedestrians swarmed the area, disregarding instructions to keep off the line. On that first day, between 10 and 15,000 people had come out to see the spectacle. Those of them who arrived before the directors would have found 3 of the 5 official competitors already present, as well as Mr. Winans' manumotive that we discussed in the last episode, of course. So the 3 were Braithwaite and Ericsson's Novelty, Hackworth's Pareil, and Brandreth's Cycloped. But what of the other 2 entrants? Well, there's good news and bad news there. The day before, the LNMR staff had begun moving most of the engines to the test ground, but a chain securing Timothy Burstall's had snapped and the loco had fallen to the ground. The fall had damaged the crank and cracked a pipe. It would take Burstall 5 days to fix it, opening him up to the accusation that he was in fact making changes to his design as he went along, and trying to improve his engine now that he could see the competition properly. Frankly though, for our purposes it isn't really important. It's clear that the Perseverance was not going to make the running. But Rocket, as it was now called, where was that? Well, just before 10 o'clock that question was answered, when Robert Stephenson's yellow-painted engine made an appearance. Driven by George, his father, it was pulling a set of carriages containing none other than the Liverpool and Manchester directors. I expect their entrance pulled by Rocket went down better with the spectators than it did with the other competitors. Still, by the time they arrived, Novelty was already putting on a show for the crowd. Reports of the time usually refer to Novelty as the people's favourite. We need to take that with a fairly healthy-sized pinch of salt, because most of the newspaper reports were simply using the same copy, and the source for it was a man who was definitely anti-Stephenson, as we'll see over the next episode or 2. But there's probably something in it. Novelty's lack of tender and its low boiler profile, not to mention shiny copper metalwork and blue paintwork, meant that it was visually striking. It looked sleek. As I said in the previous episode, Pareil probably represented the height of the traditional locomotive. It contained several improvements over the original Killingworth colliery-style engines, and to eyes that have traced the evolution of the locomotive, Rocket itself showed plenty of fascinating changes. But to the public at the time, they both no doubt looked basically the same. Both had the same elephant trunk chimney, massive cylindrical boilers, 4 wheels and a tender carriage, although they were at opposite ends, of course. And for those of the crowd who'd seen any pictures of a locomotive, this is what they were supposed to look like. Novelty was something altogether different. It looked exciting. It looked like the future. And, not to be unkind to Mr. Braithwaite, who, as we've seen, was no engineering slouch, but people often value style over substance. So despite the fact that calling Novelty the crowd favourite was the act of a consciously biased reporter, the crowd probably were rooting for the London engine. If that was the case, they were about to be disappointed. The course that the judges had set out was a straight section of line, 1.5 miles long, marked out by posts at both ends. Because the idea was to simulate the 70 miles of the journey between Liverpool and Manchester and back, there was an extra eighth of a mile at each end to allow time for the engines to get up to speed and to safely stop at the other end. Although the judges recorded the time spent changing direction and doing emergency pit stops, the most important measure was the speed between the two posts. It was there that Rastrick and Wood, the judges, stood with their stopwatches. The original plan had been to test the engines against the stipulations the directors had agreed to in April. I gave a stripped-down version of them in the last episode, but you can find a link to the full list at historyoftherailways.com/episode 5. But the judges were faced with an immediate problem squaring Novelty with those tests. The stipulations described the weight of an engine without water, because a tank engine had never been seen before. Novelty's design met the criteria, but it meant they couldn't agree how much weight it should have to pull. So as a result, the first day involved little more than Novelty and Rocket doing a series of demonstration runs without any formal tests. But those demonstrations were enough to teach the crowd what they could expect from steam engines. Rocket went first, and was soon shooting past the cheering spectators at an astonishing 24 miles an hour. It's hard to get your mind into the heads of the 19th century crowd, but remember that the stipulations called for an engine that could do 10 miles an hour, and they'd been designed to stretch the state of the art to unlock the improvements the board would need to see to prove locomotives were worthwhile. But here was the first machine to be tested, and it was already doing more than twice the stipulated speed. Of course, having a loco travel along the line without a load might have impressed the crowd, but it wasn't really much use to the directors. So despite it not counting as a formal test, the judges had Rocket coupled to wagons loaded with 3 times its own weight, and put it to work pulling them backwards and forwards along the course. To what we can only imagine was the Stephensons' and Booth's delight, Rocket slogged away reliably for almost an hour under its 12 3/4 ton load, averaging 13.5 miles an hour. The crowd must have found it truly amazing. But if they were astonished by Rocket, they didn't have long to catch their breath. Next, Novelty took to the line, and Braithwaite and Ericsson, driving it themselves, opened up the regulator, and in the words of the Leeds Mercury, the speed of all the other steam carriages on the course was far exceeded by that of Messrs. Braithwaite and Co.'s beautiful engine from London. It was the lightest and most elegant carriage on the road yesterday, and the velocity with which it moved surprised and amazed every beholder. It shot along the line at the amazing rate of 30 miles in the hour. It seemed indeed to fly. 30 miles an hour. As Braithwaite and Ericsson drove the machine past the grand tent, they took off their hats and waved them to the ladies present. It's hard to imagine anything more Victorian. And yes, before you write in to tell me, I know this is 7 years before Victoria, don't be pedantic, you know what I mean. They were rewarded with fluttering handkerchiefs and, no doubt genteel, cheers from the ladies. But why wasn't Son Pareil included in day one's fun and frivolities? Well, sadly, Hackworth's lack of time to properly test his engine before the trial had begun to bite straight away. When Son Pareil's boiler was filled with water and put under steam, Hackworth made a terrible discovery. With the trial only hours away, the boiler leaked. There was no way it was going to run. We don't know exactly when he found out about the fault. Did he discover it on the morning of the trial? To realise that his own locomotive had been sitting there in need of his attention, while he had been helping Braithwaite and Ericsson fix Novelty, must have been a cruel blow. But perhaps he'd already known when he decided to help them. Despite working as fast as possible to fix Son Pareil, it wouldn't be ready until the night of the 12th, a full week later. And an engineer of Hackworth's calibre would probably have had a good idea of how much work it would need. Even if he didn't know it would take a whole week, as soon as he saw the problem, it must have been clear that he couldn't get it done in a single night. So if he'd realised that he stood no chance of fixing his own engine in time, then helping the others probably seemed like the only decent thing to do. Clearly we can't know. But whatever the answer, it reflects well on Hackworth. Given the later acrimony between his supporters and the supporters of the Stephensons, it's good to remember his behaviour on that night. He was fair-minded enough, or just interested enough in the challenge for its own engineering sake, that he was prepared to help a competitor, rather than simply stand by and let them fail for want of an engineer. And, despite later accusations from his supporters, the reaction of the judges to Hackworth's boiler trouble reflects well on them as well. They were obviously interested in testing enough steam engines that they allowed him an extra week, and they took the same approach with Burstall, who couldn't really be said to have needed that long to fix the damage to his machine. By the end of day one, the spectators had been treated to a day full of sights nobody had ever had before. In a sneak preview of the full tests, Rocket had hauled a useful weight without any issues for an extended period. And even more exciting for the crowd, they'd seen both Novelty and Rocket racing to and fro at high speed. And while it must have been clear that the Cycloped wasn't going to take home the prize, it did at least provide entertainment. While the engines weren't running, Brandreth had taken the chance to run his contraption. Sadly, one of the horses fell through its platform. It was apparently extracted with little harm. Hopefully that means little harm to the horse, not the engine. But before calamity struck, Cycloped had amused the crowd by pulling wagons with 50 people hanging onto the sides at about 5 miles an hour. The trials ran until the 14th of October, but the excitement of that first day wasn't reached again. The crowds became smaller, the wonder of the whole thing probably having worn off slightly, and the issues with every engine apart from Rocket no doubt dampened the feeling that they'd get to see a good race. Even the entertainment provided by the muscle-powered entrants fell away after that first day. Brandreth withdrew formally from the competition, and after day one we don't hear anything further about Winans' locomotive at all. All in all, the directors should have considered the day a total success. Whatever the outcome of the tests, the carnival-like air helped establish the reputation of the LNMR. On the second day, the judges had worked out a solution to Novelty's weight question, and the London engine started its test. It fairly tore along the first leg of its run, achieving about 20 miles an hour even with its load. It looked like the crowd's expectations were going to be met. This fancy-looking engine really was the future. But on the return journey, there was a loud bang from the bellows, and the engine rolled to a stop. It had been running for less than 10 minutes. And that brought day two to a close. The third day, Thursday the 8th of October, was Rocket's full test. Just before 10:30 in the morning, the driver and fireman had the engine lined up at the starting line. Coupled behind them, they had a load of 12 tons and 1,500 hundredweight, 3 times the weight of the engine, excluding its tender. At 10:36 they got underway and ran for 10 full trips. The judges had declared that a trip was a return journey from one marker post to the other and back. The reason for this was simple. Those 10 trips would be the distance one way between Liverpool and Manchester. At that point, the engine could stop and refuel before beginning again and doing another 10 runs, simulating the trip back from Manchester to Liverpool. In Rocket's case, this broke down nicely to a morning session and an afternoon session. The buffer zones beyond each post were used to slow down and change direction. They were also a chance for the engine's team to do a fast pit stop. For example, in Rocket's morning leg, they were used to grease the pistons, oil the engine and take in water. The time for each segment was measured separately so that the judges could tell how much maintenance the engine needed and measure the running speed accurately. The highest speed it hit was 24 miles per hour, although that was for a very brief period. And discounting the 15-minute-long lunchtime gap, where the engine was restocked with coke, it ran from 10:36 in the morning until 5 p.m. precisely. Well, okay, 21 seconds past 5, without any incident whatsoever. It was a great showing, and Booth and the Stephensons were presumably pleased. But it's safe to bet that they were more than a little nervous as well. Rocket's chance to impress was over. They'd done everything they could, and now it was out of their power. All they could do was wait and see how the other teams performed once they had completed their repairs. And the attitude of those other teams to their repairs probably tells us everything we need to know about them. After Rocket had finished, Hackworth told the judges that he didn't believe he'd be able to get son Pareil fixed that week. Braithwaite wasn't present, but the judges, experienced engineers as we've seen, believed that Novelty would need a few days to repair the damage she'd experienced the day before. And with Burstall still apparently working on repairs to Perseverance, they decided the best thing to do was suspend the trials to give the other contestants the time they needed to get their engines in working order. Hackworth agreed, as presumably did Burstall, although I can't find any record of a discussion with him. But in Braithwaite's absence, the judges agreed it with someone who's recorded as his friend. As a result, they announced that the trial would restart with a run by Novelty on Monday the 12th, and that son Pareil would be tested on Tuesday the 13th. No date seems to have been set for Perseverance, which perhaps shows that the judges had already informally written him off. With a plan in place, the judges retired for the day, and the crowd started drifting away. But when Braithwaite found out, instead of accepting the extra time gratefully, he rushed to the judges and asked them to bring forward his test. They advised him against it. He insisted, so they agreed. Braithwaite and Ericsson would run on Saturday. Now, the only explanation I can think of for this act of unnecessary bravado on Braithwaite's part is that he believed he'd have a bigger crowd on Saturday. If so, he was right, but it backfired. Saturday morning found Braithwaite and Ericsson on Novelty at the starting line, with a wagon of stones weighing 6 tons and 1,700 weight coupled to the engine. At 11 a.m, the judges started their stopwatches, and Novelty was off. It made good time across the first lap, and appeared to be doing almost as well on the return. But as they passed the post for their first complete trip, they once again rolled to a halt. This time, a pipe from the feed pump to the boiler had broken. It had been running for 16 minutes and 10 seconds. Feed pipe was easy to fix, but by the time they'd done it, there was no way to run the full trial, so the judges called it a day and agreed to move Novelty's trial once more to Wednesday the 14th. A couple of hours later, after sending to a local village smith to get the pipe fixed, Braithwaite and Ericsson ran Novelty on some unofficial tests on their own. A strong supporter of theirs, Charles Vignoles, remember that name for the next episode, timed the trip between the measuring posts and calculated a speed of 17.5 miles an hour. It didn't count for anything as far as the actual trial went, but you've got to assume that it pleased Braithwaite and Ericsson, and simultaneously that it did nothing to calm the nerves of either of the other teams. On Tuesday the 13th of October, a week to the day after the trial had begun, Hackworth was finally ready to run Pareil through its paces. The machine was taken to the weighing platform, and instantly Hackworth hit his next problem. Pareil was overweight. At this point, Hackworth, if this is an appropriate phrase to apply to a 19th century gentleman, lost his cool. He insisted that the weighing machine was wrong, and that his machine was not overweight. A week's worth of fixing what he saw as problems caused by other people, and watching flashy folk parade their shiny engines around, can't have helped his temper. And if he'd read the Times, then his mood won't have been improved by the fact they'd spelt his name wrong all week. Nonetheless, the judges weren't to be swayed. They insisted that Pareil could not compete for the £500 prize, but they would let him run the trial so that they could include the results in their report for the directors. Hackworth accepted. Not the point about the weighing machine, of course, he obviously still believed that was broken, but he accepted the offer to run. So at 10 o'clock, Pareil was on the starting line with a load just shy of 11 tons. At 10 past 10 it shot away, and shot is the right word in this case. It might have looked like the most cumbersome of the contenders, but Pareil raced past the first post in the fastest time any engine had got off the blocks. And it kept up a decent speed. Once again, the Stephensons and Booth must have been on the edge of their seats. After an hour of running to and fro between the posts, she was slightly faster than Rocket had been, and just kept going. Until disaster struck. On the 8th run, the locomotive let out a loud whoosh, and steam poured forth from the boiler. The fusible plug had melted. Somehow the feed pump had stopped working, and the boiler had run almost dry. The fusible plug, designed to melt as a safety feature, had worked perfectly. But that can't have been much comfort to Hackworth. He managed to fit another plug, and make a second attempt a couple of hours later, but the pump failed again, and the judges called a halt to the experiment. Hackworth must have been crushed. Pareil had averaged 14.8 miles per hour, with a top speed of 22.6 miles an hour. But when he pushed the judges to allow him another trial on another day, they refused. They felt they'd seen enough. Pareil had performed better than anybody had expected, perhaps apart from Hackworth, but the combination of its being overweight and the amount of fuel it had consumed to get that performance meant the judges just didn't feel they could recommend it to the directors. There would be no more extensions. The next day was to be the last day of the trial, and the last engine running would be Novelty. So it was that Wednesday the 14th of October, the last day of the trial, brought the crowds back. The general feeling was that Novelty's issues so far had been irritating build problems, maybe caused by the reduced time poor Braithwaite and Ericsson had had to build her, or by the lack of test track near their workshop, or just plain bad luck. In any case, today would be the day when she finally had the chance to prove herself. So it was a little odd to say the least that when the judges arrived, they found Novelty, or at least her boiler, in pieces, and Ericsson working feverishly on her. Apparently the issue with the feed pump on the Saturday had damaged a part of the boiler that could only be reached by taking it apart. Putting it all back together again inevitably took some time, but just before 12:30 it was complete, and Braithwaite and Ericsson took Novelty for a test run on the line. The fixes from the morning held, and they told the judges they were ready to go. So at 1:25 p.m, Novelty's final test got going. This was it. The premium was going to be decided with this race. They passed the first post in 1 minute and 23 seconds, not as fast as Pareil, but a decent starting speed. The crowd must have sat forward in their seats, and who can know what the feeling was in Rocket's camp. Novelty had yet to complete a formal test, but her performance whenever she was working had been exceptional. True, it was usually only loaded with passengers, but still. Given what we know of the men concerned, it's likely that at least 2 of Rocket's builders were nervous. We can easily imagine George telling his son, and possibly even Henry Booth, to calm down. He was convinced the London engine had no guts, as he'd put it early on, and wouldn't be able to complete the task, but less confident men like Robert and Henry Booth must have wondered. Having started well, Novelty took the rest of her first lap much more slowly. In fact, at 8 miles per hour, it far and away was the slowest lap of any formal test. Did George Stephenson smile and nudge his son? If he did, then his smile might have become a little frozen on the return lap. Having satisfied themselves that everything was working, Braithwaite and Ericsson opened the regulator up and averaged 16 miles per hour, faster than 80% of Rocket's runs. And it was still only the first trip. They turned quickly and did the next lap only slightly slower. It was still early days. They'd only covered 3 miles out of a test that would run for 70, but Novelty was obviously back in the running. She turned again and headed back, and then, in what was becoming a commonplace occurrence for Braithwaite and Ericsson and the watching crowd, there was a bang, and the engine rolled to a stop. One of the joints they had fixed that morning had given way. It was obvious that it would take weeks to fix, so with all hope now gone, Ericsson approached the judges and, in the words of Nicholas Wood, Mr. Ericsson declared to the judges his wish to withdraw from a further competition for the prize. With time left in the day, Hackworth asked if he could make another attempt with Pareil, but again the judges refused. At some point during the last day, it seems that Burstall finally demonstrated perseverance, though it wasn't recorded as a formal test, and Wood again, in his inimicably polite style. The perseverance of Mr. Burstall having been found on trial not to be adapted for the purposes of the company, this gentleman, in a very handsome manner, withdrew from competing for the prize. By not adapted for the purposes of the company, he meant that it ran at about 5 miles an hour. So that was it. Novelty was out, withdrawn from having broken down 3 times. Pareil was out, disqualified by weight and considered by the judges unfit for the LNMR's needs. Perseverance was out, withdrawn having barely been shown at all, and Cycloped was out, though it had never really been in. Rocket was the last engine left standing. But more than that, it had successfully met all of the elements of the trial. George Stephenson's smile was no doubt back on his face, and not one to miss a chance to share his good fortune with others. Robert and Joseph Locke describe how Mr. Stephenson ordered it, Rocket that is, to be brought on the ground and detached from all encumbrance, and, in making 2 trips, it moved at the astonishing rate of 35 miles an hour. You know, when my kids were little, I used to tell them it's possible to be a bad winner. It feels like George Stephenson's parents perhaps skipped that chat with him. But anyway, the judges didn't declare a winner. That was up to the directors of the LNMR. But on the 14th of October 1829, it was clear to everyone that Rocket was the winner. Even the Mechanics magazine begrudgingly accepted, in an article that was once again carried verbatim in the Times. What all the tests were, it would be hard to say, but this much is certain, that the performance of 70 miles for a continuance was one criterion of excellence to which all the competitors expressed a willing submission. The Rocket started on this understanding and performed the distance at a rate of speed which, for a continuance, stands as yet unrivalled in the annals of railway racing. But that isn't quite the end of the story. Although the competitors themselves stayed out of it, their supporters fairly went to battle over the trials in the ensuing months, and, sad to say, decades ahead. So while I'm not going to spend too long on it, the story of Rainhill wouldn't be complete without covering some of the accusations that were thrown around, because even now, some of them still appear as facts, without any qualification. The most vocal recriminations in the short term came from the Braithwaite and Ericsson camp. People found it difficult to give up the idea that Novelty really did represent the future of engine design. One report, widely syndicated in papers at the time, congratulated Mr. Stephenson for the perfection to which he brought the old-fashioned locomotive engine, but said that the grand prize of public opinion is the one which has been gained by Messrs. Braithwaite and Ericsson. It is beyond a doubt that it is the principle and arrangement of this London engine that will be followed in the construction of all future locomotives, and we deeply regret that the want of sufficient time to practice the mere mechanical motion of the engine has caused Messrs Braithwaite and Ericsson to withdraw. In the immediate aftermath of the trials, there were conflicting explanations put about for Novelty's failure in the final trial. The version I gave earlier, that a joint gave way because it had only been fixed that morning, is the one that was accepted on the day. But Robert Stephenson and Joseph Locke said they'd seen a pipe which had burst. Exaggerated in the retelling, that became expanded into a burst boiler, and that then became the basis of a spat carried out in the press, which even included a letter to the editor of the Times. There's no point quoting the letter to you, but it's a good indication of how dispassionate and unbiased all of the players in these arguments were, in that it was signed Frederick Braithwaite. If they only cared about the Rainhill Trials, then it would be hard to understand what got them all so worked up about the difference. As Nicholas Wood said in his account, whether it was a joint or the collapse of the flue tube, they're both build issues, and not remotely connected to whether the innovations Novelty introduced, things like the bellows, the well tank, and the narrower snaking flue with an internal firebox, whether they were good design principles or not. But of course, Braithwaite and Ericsson weren't just interested in the trials. Their goal was to prove how good their engines were and get future sales. The Rainhill Trials were a giant advert, both for the line but also for the engineers concerned. And since the main risk of locomotives in the public mind was the boiler exploding, then anything that smacked of burst pipes had to be killed dead, if you'll pardon the terrible pun. They succeeded in that at least. By 1830, their fire engines on the same principle were working in London, and as we saw in the last episode, they were used to put out several notable fires in the capital. They even sold 2 engines on the Novelty design to the LNMR. Neither was a success, and despite Wood's generosity, most of the innovations Novelty used did not become a part of mainstream engine design. As a result, the controversy surrounding Novelty's place in the trials died down within the year. The disputes between Hackworth supporters and Rockets lasted much longer. I say Rockets supporters, but in truth it was the Stephensons supporters, for reasons that will become clear in a moment. As we saw, Hackworth had had a run of bad luck through the trials, and unlike Braithwaite and Ericsson, it's true that very little of it could be said to be his own fault. Unfortunately, after the trials were over, Hackworth, or at any rate the people around him, seemed to have become convinced that there was a Stephenson-led conspiracy to ensure Rocket won. We've already seen that Robert Stephenson and company made Pareil cylinders, and after the trial, Hackworth discovered a crack in one of those cylinders. A cylinder leaking steam might not have been the cause of him losing the competition. It shouldn't have had any impact on the feed pump, for example, but it would definitely have explained why the engine used up so much water, just one of the criticisms that had been levelled at it by the judges. And to make matters worse, that wasn't the end of it. Pareil's broken boiler, which cost Hackworth a week to repair, had been cast by Michael Lancashire at the Bedlington Ironworks. I've not mentioned Longridge before, and I probably won't again, but in the last episode, while giving a brief overview of Hackworth's life, I said that he'd refused an invitation to become a partner in Robert Stephenson and Company's 4th Street Works. Well, the man who accepted in his place was Michael Lancashire. So the man in charge of casting Hackworth's dodgy boiler was in partnership with his competitor. That Longridge's firm had made the leaking boiler was a fact plain to everyone at the trials, and an analysis carried out in 2006 for the 3rd International Railway Conference seems to prove the long-debated point about the cracked cylinder as well. But, in my view, getting from those facts to a conspiracy is a case of putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5. The state of iron casting at the time was such that we don't need to look for a conspiracy to explain either a bad boiler or a cylinder with weak walls. And despite being in partnership with Longridge at 4th Street, the Stephensons had already moved away from his Bedlington Ironworks for their boilers due to quality issues. And casting cylinders was notoriously hit and miss. When 4th Street provided the cylinders to Hackworth, they actually cast 6 for him for that very reason. That there was an invisible problem with one isn't at all surprising. That said, there were 2 things that would have made me suspicious if I was Hackworth. Firstly, how cosy the directors had been with their engineer's entry. Riding it behind it each morning to the trials might have made for a grand entrance, but it didn't exactly scream impartial. And second, when I described Rocket's preparation earlier, I told you that it had a test run at Killingworth Colliery. What I didn't mention at the time was that the reason they were able to use the track at Killingworth for their trial is that George Stephenson's friend Nicholas Wood was the manager there. Nicholas Wood, the Rainhill judge. Again, to be clear, I don't think there was any conspiracy going on at Rainhill, but it's easy to see why rumours that there was found such fertile ground. But I think the knockout argument against a conspiracy is that after the trials, once Pareil had been proven in a later test, the LNMR directors bought her from Hackworth. Since, as I said a minute ago, they also bought 2 engines from Braithwaite and Ericsson, it's hard to make a case that they were treating anyone unfairly. They even paid Timothy Burstall £25 as a consolation prize for taking part. As you'd expect, the charges of conspiracy generally died down over time. No doubt the steam was taken out of them, see what I did there, by the speed with which railways were developing after Rainhill. Everyone involved was too busy focusing on other things, and without a trigger, why waste time on this argument? So that would probably have been the end of it, if someone hadn't reignited the whole thing 3 decades later. In 1857, Samuel Smiles published a volume of his Lives of the Engineers about George Stephenson. In it, he credited George with the invention of the blast pipe, amongst just about every other railway innovation worth speaking of. And that did it. Hackworth's son, John Wesley Hackworth, an engineer in his own right, leapt to his father's defence, possibly a little too energetically. I'm not going to get into the blast pipe controversy here, as it's completely beyond the scope of this episode, and I've already spent too long discussing pointless arguments, but suffice it to say that more years' worth of rows over who deserved the credit ensued, and along the way, all of the old charges of conspiracy at Rainhill were raked up, and some new ones were made up. It's fair to say that the blast pipe arguments generated more heat than light, but if I was being generous, I could argue that they did mean that Timothy Hackworth is now getting the attention he deserves. It's impossible to research railway history and miss him, which isn't true for some other figures who should be more prominent, and perhaps we owe that to his son. But anyway, let's wrap up and bring this back to the impressive feats in 1829. It's good to know that according to the 2006 analysis I referred to earlier, Rocket really was the best engine on the field at Rainhill. If Novelty and or Pareil had been free of mechanical issues, then Booth's multi-tube boiler design and Robert Stephenson's masterful engineering would almost certainly have outperformed them over the 70-mile trial. The right engine had won. But what's more, the real question of Rainhill, could locomotives be the main motive power for a railway, had been answered. They could. And on the LNMR, they would. Stationary engines would only be used at Edge Hill. The rest of the 70-mile line would be run by locos. And on the next episode, we'll look at some of the interesting stories hidden behind those 70 miles of track as we tell the wider story of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. But before we go, here's this week's trivia question. If you're listening to this, then you probably know the name of the fastest steam locomotive, the A4-4468 Mallard. But what was its speed on its measured run at Stoke Bank in 1938? Don't miss the next episode for the answer, and if you can't wait that long, then check out historyoftherailways.com, where you'll find episode show notes and the answer to today's question. So, come and join me on the next episode as we look at the formation of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.